Chapter 16 of The Deep Lake Mystery by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Deep Lake Mystery by Carolyn Wells. Chapter 16. Whistling Reeds. March called in at Variable Winds on his way to the Tracy funeral. We were all ready to go, for though none of us wanted to, it was a matter of convention, and the whole village would have commented unkindly had we stayed away. I especially dreaded it, for I dislike funerals, and I hated the thought of the entire community sitting up there, casting glances at Alma and making whispered remarks about her. But I had to go, so I made the best of it, and, garbed in appropriate black, I sat with the others awaiting the time to start. March came in, looking harassed and worn. "It's all too dreadful," he said, sinking into a chair. "Everything seems to point to Alma Remsen, yet I am not convinced of her guilt." I started to speak, but thought better of it. Since March held that opinion, nothing I could say would help any. I'd better keep still. "I'm going to the funeral," March went on, "because it's wiser to show myself there. But I shall slip out during the service and go over to the Island House. How about going with me, Mr. Norris?" "What for?" I asked, a little suspicious of his motives. "Partly to help along by corroborating anything I may learn or discover, and partly that you may tell Mr. Moore all about it later, and save me that much work. I've none too much time for what I have to do." "Go ahead, Gray," Keeley said. "I can't leave the funeral, of course, but your absence will not be noticed. As neighbors, we must show proper respect, but our guests may be excused." "Very well, then, I'll go," I told March, for I felt I'd rather know exactly what he found out and so know what steps to take myself. I was formulating in my mind a course of procedure that I hoped might free Alma from these monstrous and false suspicions. "I'll go," I repeated, "but not because I foresee any new evidence against Miss Remsen. It's too absurd to suspect her." "It's too absurd not to," March said. "The evidence is piling up. The fingerprints and footsteps and the maid's story of seeing her that night all seem to prove she was there at the fatal hour. The strange decorations on the deathbed look like the work of a diseased mind. Posy May's story seems to prove that Miss Remsen is afflicted with some sort of spells that transform her into a demoniac. Then all the details of the waistcoats and the totem pole, the fact that she is an expert swimmer, and the strong motive of the approaching loss of her uncle's fortune—" "You're going too fast, Mr. March," I interrupted him. "Posy May's story should not be taken without some outside corroboration. She is an irresponsible child, and not fit to be a real witness. The maid, Jenny, I think, comes in the same category. I, for one, am unwilling to admit Miss Remsen the victim of any sort of malady or disease until we have a doctor's opinion on that subject. It seems to me this is only fair to the young lady." "Norris is right about that," Keeley agreed with me. "Keep these developments quiet for another 24 hours, March. No good can come from exploiting them." "No, and I don't mean to. But no harm can come of going over to the Remsen house, even if it does no good." "All right as to that. Go ahead. Go with him, Gray, and keep your eyes and ears open. The two Merivales will probably be at the funeral, but there'll doubtless be someone in charge of the place." It was time to start then, and we walked sedately out to the car, our funeral manner already upon us. The two Moores and Maud went up toward the front seats, while March and I took seats in the back of the room. The services were held at Pleasure Dome, in the great ballroom that was beneath the rooms of Sampson Tracy's suite. I looked out the window at the deep, dark lake. Sunless Sea was an apt name for it, as the trees grew thickly right down to the very edge of the water, and the great house also shaded it. A somber-looking scene, yet of a certain still peacefulness that had its own appeal. Here and there a rock lifted its jagged form up out of the water, but I realized that if a diver or swimmer were familiar with the place, he could easily avoid danger. My heart was sick at the black clouds that seemed to be closing in round the girl I loved, and I resolved anew to devote my whole heart and soul to the task of setting her free. I had no doubt of her innocence, no doubt but that these seemingly true accounts against her were really capable of some other explanation. But even if she were guilty, even if she had killed her uncle, whether in her right mind or not, she was still the one girl in the world for me. I would comfort and help her in her adversity, as I would in more joyful hours, should such ever come to us. Then I saw her come in, saw Alma enter, her arm through that of the faithful Mary, while John Merivale stalked behind them like a bodyguard. What a pair those Merivales were! Invincible seemed to be the only word that described them. Strong, brave, keen-witted, they looked forceful and capable enough to ward off all trouble from the girl they loved. But whether they could do so or not was the question. Alma, white-faced but composed, walked with a steady step and took the seat the usher offered, in the front row, her faithful henchman on either side. Mrs. Dallas was also in the front row, and the secretaries and Harper Ames. In the next row sat the entire staff of the Pleasure Dome servants. Then came the neighbors and villagers. The room was quickly filled, and many were turned away or relegated to other rooms in the house. The air was heavy with the scent of hothouse flowers, for the well-meaning donors were not content to send the lovely garden flowers blooming on their own estates. Exquisite music sounded from behind a screen of tall palms, and as the services began, March looked at me, and we silently rose and went out. "Horrible affairs, funerals," I said, wiping my brow with my handkerchief. "Oh, I don't know," the detective responded. "I rather like them. I like that exotic effect of the flowers and music and the solemn-faced audience, and the still peaceful figure in the casket. Yes, it impresses me rather pleasantly." "Then you're a ghoul," I told him irritably, which was unjust on the face of it. The good-natured chap only smiled, for he realized, I think, that my nerves were on edge. "I don't know you very well, Mr. Norris," he said, after a pause, "but I'm going to venture on a bit of advice. I know, of course, your regard for Miss Remsen, and I'm going to warn you that you may hinder rather than help her cause, unless you learn to control your feelings. Don't lose your temper when you see us detectives prying into matters that seem to you sacred. These things must be done. Your objections have no weight, and it is far wiser not to raise them. Maybe I am offending you, but my intentions are good, and you can take it or leave it." The man's honest countenance and kindly smile affected me more pleasantly than his words, and after a moment I said heartily, "I take it, Mr. March. I realize I am a blundering ass, and I'm grateful for a pull-up. But, to be frank, I never was in love before, and to find suddenly that I care for a woman with all my heart and soul, and then find her under a terrible suspicion—well, I dare say you'll admit it's a hard position." "I do. Indeed, I do. And you mustn't give up hope yet. I always keep an open mind just as long as possible. It may be some other claimant for the honor of being the criminal will turn up. I surely hope so. But in the meantime, we must just dig into things and do all we can to get more light." "You're going to search the house on the island?" "I certainly am. If I can get in, anyway. Maybe there's no one there." "Then you'd break in, I suppose." "Maybe. I'd do anything to learn a few things I want to know." We had reached the Pleasure Dome boathouse now, and from an attendant there, March commandeered a small boat, which he said he would row himself. "I like a bit of exercise," he told me, "and rowing is my preference." So we went on, past Variable Winds, on down to the island of Whistling Reeds. A quiet, rather grim-faced man helped us to make our landing, and we went up to the house. Before we reached it, March paused to give it a moment's study. We looked at its pleasant porches and its windows with light fluttering curtains. From one window, on the second floor, a face looked out at us, a girl's face, with dark bobbed hair. The head was quickly withdrawn, and we went up the steps, and March rang the bell. In a moment the door was opened by the girl whose face we had seen at the window. She now wore a bit of a frill cap with a black velvet bow. This she had obviously donned at the sound of the doorbell. "We have come," March said to her in his pleasant way, "to look over the house." "It isn't for sale," she said, not frightened at all, but seeming a little amused. "I know. I don't want to buy or rent it. Are you the parlor maid?" "I'm Miss Remsen's personal maid, lady's maid," she returned, bridling a bit, as if to be a parlor maid was beneath her rank. "Oh, I see. I thought Miss Remsen had her nurse." "Yes, Mrs. Merivale is my mother. We both look after Miss Alma." "I'm sure she's well taken care of. Now—" "Dora, sir," she said, divining his question with quick intuition. "Well, Dora, I suppose you are devoted to Miss Remsen?" "Oh, that I am, sir. I'd die for her." "Well, we don't want you to do that, but something far easier. We just want you to answer a few questions. Is anybody in the house beside yourself?" "Nobody, sir." "All gone to the funeral?" "Yes, sir. All but Michael, down at the dock, and me." "Very well. Now, do you remember the night Mr. Tracy died?" "Yes, sir." "Where was Miss Remsen that night?" "Here at home, sir." "What did she do through the evening?" "She read in a book, sir, then she played the piano a bit, and then she went to bed." This was reeled off glibly, a little too glibly, I thought. It sounded parrot-like, as if a lesson, learned by rote. Evidently March thought so too, for he said, looking at her closely, "How do you know this?" "How do I know?" She looked a little blank. "Oh, yes, I know, because I saw her now and again as I passed through the hall." "I see. Now, what book was she reading, do you know?" "No, sir, I don't know that." "But you saw her reading?" "Yes, sir." "Well, what kind of book was it? A big book?" No, sir, I think not. I think it was a smallish book." "With a paper cover?" "Yes, sir, with a paper cover." "Stop it, March!" I cried involuntarily. "You shan't put words into her mouth." "Keep still, Norris," he said sternly, "and remember what I told you." I supposed he meant that I could serve Alma best by learning everything possible about her, but I resented this sort of procedure. The girl was frightened too. She drew her breath quickly, as if fearing she had been indiscreet, but March restored her equanimity by his next words. "That's all right, Dora," he said. "It doesn't matter what book she had, or what music she played. Then she went to bed? She didn't go out anywhere?" "Oh, no, sir. It was near 10 then. Miss Remsen never goes out evenings, unless to a party, and then somebody fetches her, or Mother goes with her." "Well, you've told a straight story, and that's all we want to know. Now, I'm going to give the house the once-over." "What's that, sir?" "A glance about. You see, Dora, I'm connected with the police, and—" "The police, sir?" she cried, and sank into a chair. But suddenly she sprang to her feet again, and said in a low, tense tone, "Will you please go away, sir? Go away, and come when my father or mother shall be here." "No, Dora, we can't do that. You ought to know that the police cannot be told what to do. But rest assured, we mean no harm to your young mistress, and we are hoping to find some clues or evidence that will free her from suspicion." Dora looked thoroughly perplexed. She glanced from the window, as if of a mind to call Michael, but he was not in sight. "And I may as well tell you," March continued, his iron hand still in a velvet glove, "that you'd better let us have our way, without raising any objection. For you can't stop us, and you'd only create unpleasantness for yourself." Dora seemed to see reason, and she nodded her head in assent. "What do you want me to do?" she asked in a subdued voice. "Go with us and show us the rooms, that's all. We shall not really disturb anything, and it will save Miss Remsen trouble if we can get through before her return." So Dora went ahead, with an air of obedience under protest that showed itself in her dragging footsteps and her somber eyes. "This is the living room," she said, indicating the room we already knew. March stepped inside. He quickly scanned the appointments, but he had seen them before and paid real attention only to the bookcase. This produced nothing of interest, however, and we went on through a cozy little writing room to the dining room, a delightful, cheery room hung with chintzes and gay with bowls of flowers. To my amazement, the detective devoted his scrutiny to the dining table. He examined the wood of it carefully, and then, drawing a lens from his pocket, peered through it in true Sherlock Holmes fashion. I wondered if this was meant to impress the staring Dora, but March seemed to be interested in his own account, and he pocketed his lens with a sigh of satisfaction. "Now the kitchen," he said, and we went thither. A modern, immaculate kitchen it was, with all the up-to-date contrivances for lightening labor and for achieving quick results. March took in most of it at a glance, pausing only to turn round a can of cocoa on a shelf in the glass-doored cupboard. "Yes," he said, smiling at Dora, "I think that's the best brand, too." Then we went upstairs. It seemed sacrilege to me to go into Alma's bedroom, but March strode forward as a general to an attack. He made no noise or disturbance. He opened no cupboards or bureau drawers. He looked closely at the bedside table, which showed only a reading lamp, a book or two, a small flask of cologne water, and an engagement pad and pencil. "Miss Alma has her breakfast in bed?" he said interrogatively. and I wondered if he had seen a spot on the lace table cover, or how he knew. "Yes, sir, both Sundays and weekdays, sir." Dora was blushing furiously now, though I could see no reason for it at mere mention of breakfast and bed. March seemed not to see it, and we went on to the next room. This was a large and delightful room, the counterpart of Alma's bedroom. "The guest room," Dora said, and stood aside to let us enter. "And a pretty one. Are there guests often?" "Oh, yes, sir. Miss Alma frequently has young ladies to stay the night with her." "I see. A charming room." He set down his stick, while he leaned out of the window for a glimpse of the lake. He looked into the guest bathroom, but it showed only the immaculate cleanliness beloved of all good housekeepers, and then we went back into the hall. "Where are the servants' rooms?" he asked. "Up in the third story, sir. Want to go up?" Dora opened a door at the foot of a flight of stairs, but March said, "No, not necessary," and she closed it again. "Now we'll go downstairs," he said, and we started. He let Dora precede him, and then pushed me along next. Exclaiming, "Oh, I've left my stick," he returned to the guest room, and came out again carrying the stick in question. I felt sure the stick was a blind of some sort, but I couldn't see how he had found any clue in the guest room, and I was weary of the farce anyway. What did he expect to find? As far as I could see, he hadn't found anything at all. "Well, Dora," he said, as we regained the porch and were about to leave, "you've been very kind. You can tell Miss Remsen and your parents all about it, and tell them you behaved just exactly right." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." "Has Miss Remsen a beau?" "She's not engaged, sir, but several young men are sweet on her." "Who?" I cried, feeling that I'd like to knock the several heads together. "I think Mr. Billy Dean is the nicest," Dora said, apparently quite willing to gossip. "Miss Remsen is never ill, is she?" March broke in. "Oh, no, sir, never." "Never has to take anything to induce sleep?" "Oh, no, never." But this time there was a hesitation, and I pictured Alma as unable to sleep and resorting to a mild sedative. "All right, Dora, good-bye, and many thanks." We went down to the boathouse, and the man there was still glum and unsmiling. Nor did our substantial douceur give him any apparent pleasure. He pocketed it without a word, and pushed off our boat with a jerk that had the effect of his being glad to be rid of us. March was unperturbed by all of this, and of course it mattered little to me. I was consumed with curiosity to know if March had learned anything indicative. "I found a few trifles," he vouchsafed to tell me, "but I can't describe them at the moment." "Being a detective, you have to be mysterious," I growled. "Yes, just that," he agreed cheerfully, and we proceeded in silence. "They're just leaving the burying ground," he said, at last. "Shall we go and pay our final respects?" "If you like," I said, indifferently. So we landed at Pleasure Dome, and then betook ourselves to the tiny graveyard, which was down beyond the orchard. It was a lovely spot, shaded by long branches of weeping willows, and brightened by beds of carefully tended flowers. Lilies abounded, and there were patches of the lovely California poppies and screens covered with sweet peas. I became interested in the graves, and March pointed out those of Alma's parents and her little sister. "The child was 8 years old when she died," I commented. "I thought it was an infant." "No, a girl. Alma remembers her, of course. But it was all before my day. I've only lived here 7 years. Flowers enough on Tracy's grave, in all conscience." The mound of the new grave was heaped with flowers, indeed an impressive sight. The growing flowers and the cut blossoms vied with each other in beauty, and harmonized into one glorious whole of gorgeous bloom. All had left but 2 or 3 workmen, and they withdrew to a respectful distance while March and I stood there. "Tell me, March, did you find anything? I can't bear this suspense." "Please believe I don't want to keep you on tenterhooks," he said, with real regret in his tone. "But what I did discover is so contradictory, so impossible of solution, at present, that I can't divulge it until I find some meaning to it. What did you make of the girl Dora?" "Nothing. She seemed to me just an ordinary servant." "Don't you believe it. She's far from being an ordinary servant. That girl knows all there is to know." "What do you mean?" "Just what I say, and we've got to get that knowledge." "Of course, then, if she knows anything, it's to do with Alma. She wouldn't know anything about any other suspect." "Look here, Norris, you'll have to remember that I'm out to find the murderer of Sampson Tracy. I'm not considering whether the evidence I collect is going to implicate this one or that one, or whether it isn't. I want only the truth." "Well, I don't," I told him. "I want to clear Alma Remsen, and I'd perjure myself straight into perdition if it would do her any good." "Well, it wouldn't. Your word, after that speech, isn't worth the effort it takes to speak it, as you must see for yourself. Why don't you try to realize that that sort of talk won't get you anywhere, nor help the girl either? Why don't you try to understand that to find the real murderer is the only thing to free Miss Remsen, and the only way to do that is to investigate?" All of a sudden I saw myself for a silly fool. "You're right, March," I said earnestly, "and I'm going to try." "That's more like it," he applauded. "Come on, we'll work together." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Deep Lake Mystery by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Deep Lake Mystery by Carolyn Wells. Chapter 17. Ames Takes a Hand. "I've just read a detective story where a sweet young girl was the criminal, after all," Maud said, contributing an argument to our conversation. It was Sunday, the day after the Tracy funeral. As we sat on the porch after the midday dinner, Ames came along and joined our group. "Well, Mr. Moore," he said, "unless you consider yourself engaged by me on the Tracy case, and you certainly have never given me to understand that, I am ready to call the deal off." "Why?" Keeley said, offering him a cigar. "Principally because the evidence seems so strong against Alma Remsen, and I've no wish to see that girl convicted." "Why not?" "First, because she isn't guilty, and second, because if she were guilty, I don't want to be in any way instrumental in bringing it home to her." "You'd compound a felony." "Oh, rubbish! But yes, of course I'd compound a felony rather than raise a finger to help establish her guilt." "What makes you think she is guilty?" "I didn't say I thought she was guilty. I said the evidence seems to point that way. But evidence doesn't always point to the truth by any means." "Very true. Have you any other suspect?" "I'm not looking for suspects. I want to get away from the whole business." "Yet only a few days ago you wanted me to investigate this matter at your direction and at your expense." "I know it, but I've changed my mind. I want to go away, to go back home. If I'm needed for any purpose, you can always find me. I'm not going to disappear." "I don't think you'll be wanted by the authorities, Mr. Ames, if that's what you mean. I have crossed you off my list of suspects, and I think Detective March has done the same. However, you will speak to them, of course, before you leave town." "Oh, certainly. And, Mr. Moore, I've been doing a bit of looking about on my own. I don't know that it will be of help or even interest to you, but I've satisfied myself that nobody at Pleasure Dome was the murderer of Sampson Tracy." "You mean no member of the household?" "Yes, none of the staff of servants, neither of the secretaries, nor myself. That completes the tale of the occupants of the house that night." "And how have you come to your conclusions?" "By questioning, both straightforward and also more adroit. I have talked to the servants, and I have examined their rooms and possessions, and I have no hesitancy in pronouncing them all innocent." "Perhaps they know something about it, though." "Not the ones who are there now. A few, I believe, have been dismissed. They may know something. I cannot get at them, of course. But those who are there, and they are the principal ones, are innocent, and are eager to find the criminal." "They do not, then, suspect Alma Remsen? Surely they would not be anxious to discover her guilty." "No, they will hear no word against her. Griscom, especially, flies into a rage at a hint of her implication in the matter." "And the two secretaries?" "Are as innocent as I am. I can scarcely expect you to take my word about myself, but I want a witness for Everett and Dean." "They had no reason to kill Tracy, for I don't agree that their expected legacies were sufficient motive. I had a motive, I suppose, as I sorely needed the money he left me, but I didn't kill him to get it." Ames didn't smile. He made his statement in a calm, honest way that carried absolute conviction. And there was no evidence against Ames. Had he wanted to kill Tracy, he surely would not have gone to the trouble to fix up all those foolish decorations, nor would he have been apt to think of making that telltale scratch across his own door. "I think nobody suspects you, Mr. Ames," Keeley said, and Ames returned, "No, nobody does. They're all on the trail of Alma Remsen. By all, I mean, of course, the police. There's nobody else sleuthing that I know of, except yourself." "There is plenty of evidence that seems to point to Miss Remsen," Kee said slowly. "The question is, does it really indicate her? Did you ever hear, Mr. Ames, that she was in any way affected, either physically or mentally, by a disorder that would make her irresponsible in her behavior?" Ames moved uncomfortably in his chair. "I'd rather not answer that question," he said, "but I suppose my disinclination to reply would be construed as affirmative. So, while I decline to discuss it, I will admit that I have heard rumors to that effect." "Then if it can be proved that she is mentally affected, surely no punishment can come to her, even in case of conviction." "Perhaps not. But if she is mentally afflicted, it seems all the more horrible to add to her sufferings the horrors of a trial." My heart warmed toward Harper Ames. At least he had the instincts of a human being, and not those of a cold-blooded sleuth. You feel, as I do, that the bizarre effects of that deathbed implies, or at least suggests, the work of a disordered mind? Either that or an exceedingly clever mind trying to give the effect of a more or less demented person. Have you, in your talks with the servants or secretaries, learned any rational explanation for those strange conditions? None at all. One more question, please, Mr. Ames, Key said gravely, and then I have done. Have you, since the death of Sampson Tracy, learned of any incident aside from these strange conditions we have mentioned that seems to you to implicate Miss Remsen?" An obstinate look came over Ames's face, and he shook his head, but it was plain to see that he was concealing something. "You can't expect us to believe that half-hearted negation," Key said with a nod of understanding. "I know you don't want to accuse that poor girl of anything more, but try to realize that what you think against her interests may be for them." "That's a new way to put it," and Ames looked a little bewildered. "But it might be true. You know in the story books the nephew is always overheard having a violent altercation with his uncle, but he is always proved innocent. Who overheard Miss Remsen quarreling with her uncle?" "I did. I may as well tell you, for I dare say it is my duty. And it may, as you say, redound to her favor, although I can't see how. Well, I was passing through the hall on the Tuesday afternoon, the afternoon she said she was there, you know, and the two were in the library. The door was partly open, and with no intent of eavesdropping, I couldn't help hearing some words as I went by. Alma was talking, and while not loud, her voice was strained, tense, as if with deep feeling or passion. She was saying, 'Please don't tell Mrs. Dallas, Uncle. Please don't. If you do, I shall do something desperate. I can't bear it to have you tell her. She hates me anyhow, and it would make her hate me worse. Uncle, I beg of you.' I heard no more, as I went right along." "You're sure of what you did hear?" "Sure of the intent. I may not have the words exact, but Alma was very angry and Tracy very decided. I gathered that. And the speech I heard was absolutely as I have told you in meaning, if not in identical language." "Well, let's come right down to it. You think Tracy proposed to tell his prospective bride that his niece had an affliction that made her uncertain of herself at times?" "That is what I think. I know that Tracy planned to tell Mrs. Dallas something, and you know she declared that herself. So, hearing Alma say what she did, how can one help putting two and two together?" "It may be as you say. But what about the theory that Alma is shielding somebody?" "Who can it be? Only one or both of those strange old people who take care of her. And somehow I can't see her running her own head into a noose to save them, even if they are in danger, which, by the way, I haven't heard that they are." "They're not definitely suspected that I know of, but I've thought it might be that they were so upset by Tracy's determination to expose the secret of Alma's affliction that one of them might kill him to prevent such a disclosure." "Ingenious as a theory," Ames said, "but not very probable as I see it." "Why not?" "First of all, would either of those people, capable of murder though they might be, cut up all those monkey tricks that look like the work of a diseased mind? Just the way to draw suspicion on their beloved charge." "That's a facer," Key agreed, "unless they didn't think of that, and only arranged the flowers and things with a view toward general bewilderment." Not good enough. No, Alma isn't shielding anybody, but she is queer, very queer. And the older servants, Griscom and Fenn, are worried sick about her." "They don't believe she did it?" "They don't know what to believe. There's so much against the girl. And there's a rumor that somebody saw her over there that night." "Who saw her?" "I can't find out. One maid told me another maid had told her so, but Fenn came along and gave the girl a dressing down, and she won't open her lips now." "Well, Mr. Ames, I'm grateful for the facts you have detailed. Every fact helps, just as every opinion hinders. Isn't Miss Remsen now the owner and head of the Pleasure Dome estate?" "In a way, yes. Legally, of course, she is the rightful heir. And as she is not under arrest, she can take possession if she chooses. But she says she won't go there until this inquest matter is over, and then, I suppose if she should be accused and arrested, the place would be shut up for a time." "Hard lines on Mrs. Dallas," Maud said, "losing her expected fortune and prominent position." "Yes and no." Ames smiled a little. "Between you and me, Mrs. Merrill, although Mrs. Dallas is terribly shocked at the manner of his death, I can't feel she is mourning deeply for Mr. Tracy. I think Charlie Everett had pretty well cut out the elderly millionaire." "Well, that's her business," Lora said coldly. "I am so sorry for Alma. I've no sympathy to spare for Mrs. Dallas. They can't arrest the girl if she isn't responsible for her actions, can they?" "I don't know. It depends on conditions and circumstances." "I hope, Mr. Ames," I said, speaking more pleasantly than I felt, because I had no wish to antagonize him, "that you won't feel it necessary to tell anyone else what you have told us. Mr. Moore, of course, will tell the police whatever he deems wise, but I mean the matter needn't become village gossip." "No, Mr. Norris," Ames returned. "I have no wish to have Miss Remsen's name bandied about. And now that I have told all I know, my own conscience is clear, and if not detained by the authorities, I shall go home. But I dare say they will keep me until after the finish of the inquest on Friday." Ames went off, and his departure was closely followed by the arrival of that detestable little Posy May. I cordially disliked the girl, and I felt sure she was bringing fresh tales about Alma. Nor was I wrong. The flapper swung herself over the arm of a big chair, and landed Turkish fashion in its depths, demanded cigarettes and their attendant paraphernalia. Then, with a solemn, owl-like expression on her pert little face, she said, "I have additional information." Keeley prepared to listen, for he had often said he gained more knowledge from outsiders than from the regular force. "Yes," Posy went on, "I've been inquiring round among the folks who live nearest to the Whistling Reeds Island, and I've found 3 who have seen Alma when she was in her tantrums." "Look here, Miss May," I said, hoping to trap her, "how is it that you or your friends you've been interviewing can see what goes on in the island? I've been there, and it seems to me it's so walled in by trees and shrubs that there's little visible from the lake." "That's true, Mr. Norris." Posy spoke seriously. "But there is a place at the back of the house, a sort of vista, small but open. I think somebody removed a tree or two in order to see out. If your boat is in line with that, you can see it quite plainly. That's where I saw Alma when she was paddywhacking the old nurse, and that's where my friends have seen exhibitions of the same sort." Posy had a quaint way with her when she was serious, and somehow she gave the impression of sincerity in what she said. Anyway, she had the attention of her hearers, and she went on, excitedly, "So I asked the girls, and they couldn't remember at first, and then the three of them said yes, they had seen Alma through that opening in the trees. And they said, one of them did, that she saw Alma going for the nurse with a croquet mallet. And the man, that's the nurse's husband, had to come and pull Alma off his wife." "Now, Posy," Kee looked at her sternly, "I don't want these yarns at all if there's a bit of fairy story about them. Do you know them to be true?" "I honestly think so, Mr. Moore, because I made Ethel—it was Ethel Wayne who told me this one—cross her heart and hope to never if it wasn't true. And Ethel is a truthful girl, anyway. Why, once she—" "Never mind sideshows. Now, if you feel certain you have true stories to tell, get on with the others. Who's next?" "Oh, you hurry me so. Well, then I struck Mary Glenn. She is a very serious thinker, and she wouldn't exaggerate a tiny mite, she wouldn't. And she said she saw something she never had told anybody, not even her mother. And she wouldn't tell me at first, till I told her it was official work I was doing, and that if she didn't tell, I'd set the force on her. You know everybody is quelled at mention of the law, and so she came off her perch and told me." "Told you what? Now repeat it as she said it, don't embroider it any." "No, sir. Well, she said she saw Alma through that same gap in the hedge, and Alma wasn't angry or anything like that, but she was throwing things into the lake, and the nurse was trying to stop her, but she couldn't. Alma threw in her string of beads, and then her hat, and then her slippers, and then a book she had with her, and then something else, Mary couldn't see what that was. And all the time the nurse was saying, 'Now, Miss Alma, oh, please be good, Miss Alma,' and like that. So, if Alma Remsen isn't off her head, I don't know who is." "You said there were 3," Moore said, quietly. "Go on, please." "The last is the strangest of all," Posy said, with a tense calm quite like Keeley's own. "Daisy Dodd told me, and she's a most reliable person. I'd trust Daisy to tell the truth about anything. Well, she was out in her canoe one afternoon, late, you know, about dusk, and she saw Alma come out through that gap in the trees and stand on the edge of the lake. It's awful deep there, and there's quite a high bank. Well, Alma stood on the bank, and all of a sudden she put up her hands and splash! She dove in. Daisy was scared to death, it was so deep and all, but Alma came right up and swam off a few strokes, and then she swam back to shore and scrambled up the bank all dripping wet." "Had she on a bathing suit?" "No, that's just it. She had on her everyday clothes, one of those sports suits she most always wears, and she came out of the water, like a drowned rat, and then stood looking at herself as if surprised she should have done what she did." "Was the nurse on the scene that time?" "Daisy said she rode on then, but as she was nearly past, she heard somebody cry out, 'Oh, Miss Alma, what have you been up to?'" "Well, Posy, is that all?" "Yes, Mr. Moore, and you can depend on it all as being true, at least so far as I know. And I know those girls would never make up those yarns. There'd be no sense in that, would there?" "No, I can't see that there would," Keeley said, speaking absent-mindedly as if his thoughts were on the stories he had just heard. "Posy, you're a good girl," Lora said, feeling I was sure that somebody ought to give the girl the applause she had earned. "But you're going to keep those things secret for us, aren't you?" "Yes'm, I'm going to do just what you and Mr. Moore tell me, for I've made up my mind. I've found myself, and I'm going to make detective work my vocation. I think I have a decided talent for it, and I am sure—" "Well, Posy," Keeley said, suddenly waking up, "if you want to be a detective, one of the first things to learn is to keep your mouth shut. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir. I've just promised Mrs. Moore not to say a word until you say I may." "That's a good girl. Now, if that finishes your report, I'll excuse you for today. I have to act upon your information, you know. You feel sure, don't you, that these episodes happened just as you've narrated them?" "Yes, I do. I know those girls, and what they say they saw, they saw. Daisy said she thought Alma was a little lacking, but the others didn't say that. They only thought she had a fierce temper that broke out suddenly sometimes." "Either of those things may be true, but don't think about it. Run off now and play with your sheik, and forget all about this case until you get some further knowledge that is both true and important. But remember, not a word of it to anyone, not anyone at all." "See my finger wet, see my finger dry, see my finger cut my throat if I tell a lie," said the girl, in a sing-song tone, and with accompanying dramatic gestures of fearful histrionic fervor. Then she ran away, and we sat and looked at one another. "The problem seems to be solved," I said. "Seems to be," Moore returned, and something in his voice gave me a grain of hope. I don't know what it was not really encouragement, but I knew he had a ray of light from somewhere, and I had to be content with that. "You believe all Posy said, don't you, Kee?" Lora asked. "Yes, I do. Those youngsters aren't going to make up such things, and I know that gap in the line of trees. I've often looked in there, but I never had the luck to see any drama enacted." "Why do they have that break when they seem so anxious for utter concealment?" Maud inquired. "Maybe the servants cut it for convenience in taking in parcels, or to look for their sweethearts," Kee surmised. "Or perhaps it just happened that a couple of trees died and haven't yet been replaced. I say, Gray, why don't you go over to see Alma?" I nearly fell off my chair at this, and my heart bounded at the idea. Then I thought what it might mean, and I said bitterly, "To spy on her and come home and tell you what I've ferreted out?" "I feared you'd say something like that," he returned gently. "But while you can do that or not, as you choose, I tell you honestly, I had only your own interest at heart when I suggested it." "Then I'll go," I said heartily, knowing Kee incapable of insincerity. "What are you going to give as a reason for calling?" Lora asked, smiling kindly at me. "The truth," I said, smiling back, and in a few moments I was off. I jumped into a rowboat, a canoe was not such a familiar craft to me as the others, and I rowed away to the island house. The dour boathouse keeper met me, and after a mere word of greeting, I hurried up the path to the house. Mary herself answered my ring, and at first she looked stern and unapproachable. "Miss Alma is seeing nobody, sir," she informed me. "She is lying down just now." "Won't you ask her if she couldn't give me a few minutes? I'm not here on business of any sort. I'm just making a social call, and perhaps I can cheer her up." I had unwittingly struck the right note, for Mary smiled a little, though the tears came into her eyes, too, and she gave me a long look as she said, "Sit on the porch, please, sir, and I'll ask Miss Alma." I sat down, and there, in that strange, eerie stillness, in that quiet, mysterious atmosphere, I vowed my life to Alma Remsen. I consecrated my heart and soul to my darling, and I determined to save her from this cloud that seemed to hang over her. To be sure, my ideas of this salvation, and indeed of the cloud itself, were a trifle vague, but both mind and soul were full of her and her dearness, and at a light step behind me I turned to see her coming down toward me across the veranda. All in white, her golden curls a little tumbled, and her big, beautiful eyes a little heavy with trouble and sadness, she came, her two hands outstretched as if asking my aid. I rose slowly as she slowly advanced, and it seemed to me that as she traversed those few feet across the porch, and as I awaited her, we asked and answered all the necessary questions, and when at last I held her two dear hands in mine, I drew her nearer into my arms and clasped her to me. She made no resistance. She did not hold back or repulse me, but lay against my breast like a tired child finding haven at last. I held her so, soothing her a bit, and caressing her golden head, but saying no word lest I startle her. In a moment she lifted her head, her eyes gazed into mine, and all the woe and sorrow came back into them. "No, dear," I said. "No, don't look like that. Look happy." "Happy," she said, with an awful intonation. "Yes," I said, "like this," and I kissed her. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Deep Lake Mystery by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Deep Lake Mystery by Carolyn Wells. Chapter 18. All Right at Last. It was just after I had given Alma that first kiss, and had realized that she was not offended by my daring, that Mary came to the house door, crying out, "Come, Miss Alma, come quickly!" And with an agonized look, Alma begged me to go at once, and she herself ran into the house. Then John Merivale came out, and controlling his agitation with an effort, he said, "If you please, sir, Miss Remsen asks that you go home now. She cannot see you again, and she will send you some word later on." "Tell me what's the trouble, Merivale," I urged. "I am a friend of Miss Alma, more than a friend indeed." I looked at him squarely, as man to man, and he gazed back at me, his face drawn with strong emotion of some sort. "If you want to help her, sir, you'll just go quietly away. You can do nothing here." So there was nothing to do but to go, and I started off down the garden path. I looked back at the house as I stepped on the dock, but I saw nobody at any window, nor any sign of anybody about. It was all mysterious, terribly so, but I had the remembrance of that moment when I had held Alma close in my arms, and she had offered no resistance. Surely, some day, the clouds would clear away and all would be explained. Slowly I rode back to the Moore cottage and pondered as I went. When I reached Variable Winds, I found the family and Detective March in full conclave. Spread on a table before them lay a conglomerate collection of small objects, among which I recognized a lot of beads that I had seen Alma wear, a pretty finger ring, and several other odd bits of jewelry. Also some scraps of bright-colored silk that I felt intuitively were bits of the Tracy waistcoats. Also a totem pole broken into 3 pieces. I sat down with the others and prepared to enter the discussion. "I want to know all about it," I said. "All you know. Don't keep anything back with the idea of sparing my feelings. I have not had a definite talk with Alma, but I have reason to think she cares for me, and I am content to bide my time. But I propose to do all I can to save her from what I feel sure is a mistaken suspicion of her guilt in the Tracy matter." "Very well," said March, looking at me gravely. "Then please understand that the evidence against Miss Remsen is overwhelming. You know most of it, you have heard nearly all the details of the case as they have come to light. Now try to realize that the accumulation of all these facts is a mountain of proof that will be hard to move." "I have heard it stated," I said calmly, "that circumstantial evidence, though seemingly convincing, must never be taken as absolute proof." Keeley stared at me as if amazed, but I stood my ground. "You'll have to get a human witness before you can declare a certainty." "True enough, Mr. Norris," March agreed. "And we have plenty of human evidence. Mr. Ames's story of the quarrel between Miss Remsen and her uncle you have heard. All that time Miss Remsen declared she would do something desperate if Sampson Tracy persisted in his determination to tell Mrs. Dallas something that Alma wanted kept secret. What could that be, save the fact of her own defective health or impaired mentality? She said Mrs. Dallas already hated her, and, knowing that, would hate her more. What other construction can possibly be put on those words? Then, we have Jenny's story of Miss Remsen's behavior the night of Mr. Tracy's death. That girl would never invent a story so wildly improbable as the tale of Miss Remsen jumping from the window into the lake. "You'll have to admit all March says is true, Gray," Keeley said to me, his fine face drawn with deepest concern. "And also the stories Posy May has told us. They bear the stamp of truth, and they are all human evidence, not merely circumstantial. Now I will tell you the conclusion that I have been obliged to arrive at, and that is that Alma Remsen is indeed afflicted. Not with epilepsy, but with a far more serious malady. I mean dementia praecox. This is a terrible statement to make, but I am sure it is the only diagnosis that fits the case. As you may or may not know, that condition may be in existence, yet remain unknown and unsuspected by those nearest and dearest to the patient." "No!" I cried, recoiling from the thought of horrors that this idea conjured up. "That lovely girl—" "You know nothing about the disease, Gray," Keeley said, patiently. "I didn't know much about it myself until I read it up, which I have just done. It has many forms and phases, but there are some symptoms inseparable from the conditions. For instance, and this is the thing that impressed me from the very first. You remember I said the watch in the water pitcher was the keynote? Well, I had a vague idea, and my recent study has corroborated it, that victims of this dread disease almost invariably throw a watch into a jar or pail of water, if they get a chance. That is a common peculiarity, and all the queer work around Tracy's deathbed points unmistakably to a mind disordered by dementia praecox, and nothing else. Epilepsy won't do. That's a different disease. But the feather duster, the flowers, the waistcoat business, the totem pole, and more than all, the fatal nail, all indicate the same thing. Now, this disease has the strange quality of becoming evident at times, and then disappearing so utterly that no one would suspect its presence in the person affected. March and I have concluded that Alma Remsen is a victim of this horrible curse, and that her actions are in no way of her own volition during the attacks of the dementia." "I can't believe it," I said, after a straight glance into Keeley's sympathetic eyes. "But I suppose I must take your word for it. However, it makes no difference in my love and loyalty to Alma, but I want to get at the truth. Now, if it is true, her doctor must know about it, and I can't think Dr. Rogers would have gone off and left her if there was danger of attacks of such a sort." "That's the way it seemed to me," Keeley said. "Now listen, Gray, and we'll tell you all. We have tried to think Alma is shielding somebody maybe that is a victim of dementia praecox. We thought of the two Merivales, and we considered their daughter, Dora. Any of the three are possible, you see. Then, owing to some things March noticed when making his search at Whistling Reeds, we had a new suspicion. He observed 2 breakfast trays in the pantry cupboard that had the general effect of being in frequent use, and the dining table was used for 2. He observed a can of cocoa, though he had been told that Miss Remsen had always coffee for her breakfast. He thought the guest room showed signs of being in use when there was no acknowledged company there. Indeed, he brought that lot of stuff on the table from the guest room wastebasket. As you see, there are bits of jewelry and a lot of beads and such odds and ends. Those are the things a demented person throws away. Also, there are bits of the waistcoats that have been so much talked about. Well, we came to the conclusion that there was another inmate of that house beside Alma Remsen. Some relative or friend she was shielding, or perhaps the nurse of her daughter. Again, it might be a man, say an unacknowledged brother or cousin, whose very existence had been kept secret. Anyway, there was a very decided mystery to be unraveled at Whistling Reeds. But then Posy May's stories, and Jenny's too, brought it all back to Alma herself, and while we hated to do it, we had to find out. And the surest way was through Dr. Rogers. So I telegraphed him at a dozen or more different places where he might be possibly found, and one of them hit its mark." Keeley drew a telegram from his pocket and passed it over to me. It sounded cryptic, for it ran thus: "Yes, a R victim of D.P. Records in my safe. Lincoln holds key." "And so," March said, rising, "we are just going over to the office of Dr. Rogers to investigate the matter. You may go or not, as you wish." "Don't go, Gray," Lora said, gently. "It is not necessary, and will only cause you suffering. Keeley will tell you all when he comes back. You stay here with me." "Thank you, Lora, dear," I said, "but I must go. I must know every development as it takes place. I'm a little dazed with this news from the doctor, but I can't help feeling there's a mistake somewhere. It can't be that Alma—" I stopped suddenly, for I remembered seeing her on the lake that night, and hearing her say afterward that she never went on the lake in the evening. Then, when she had these attacks, she acted without knowledge of what she was doing. If she had, under these conditions, killed her uncle, she was of course in no way responsible, and would not be held so. Maud and Lora looked sorrowfully after us, and we 3 went down the path to the drive and got into Keeley's car. At Dr. Rogers' office we found his assistant in charge. He had but a few of the doctor's cases to look after, and these were the simpler ones. Serious matters had been placed in the hands of more skilled practitioners, and some few important ones, we were told, were given over to specialists. March showed him the telegram and asked what it meant. "Well," said Dr. Greenway, a pleasant-faced young man, "I guess I can help you out on that. My orders are to meet the wishes of anyone bringing a telegram couched in that language. As you have doubtless deduced," he smiled at the detective, "it means the key to the safe is hidden—" "Behind Lincoln's picture," cried Kee, before March could speak. "Yes," smiled the young man, his eyes following ours to the large engraving of Lincoln on the wall. He stepped up on a chair, turned the frame from the wall a little, and from an envelope pasted on the back of the picture he extracted a paper. "This is the combination," he explained, "which is what he means by key." Following the message on the paper, he twirled the dials and soon opened the safe. "I will leave you to your investigations," he said. "This must be an important matter, or Dr. Rogers wouldn't have sent that information. Those are his case books. I leave them in your charge. When you are finished with them, I will return and close the safe again. I shall be in the next room." He went out and closed the door, and we looked into the safe, wondering what secret it would divulge. So well was everything labeled and indexed that we had no trouble at all in finding the pages marked Remsen. Keeley and March did the research work, I sitting idly by, but alert to find their findings. In a moment I saw the utmost surprise and excitement manifest on their faces. They read from the same page, silently, eagerly, and then Keeley lifted his head, and with a look of pure joy in his face, cried out, "Take heart, Gray! Alma is all right!" My heart almost stopped beating. I couldn't speak, but my whole soul seemed to go out in great prayer of gratitude that swallowed up all other emotion. I did not hasten them or beg for further disclosures. I knew they would come in good time. At last they gave over reading, and turned to look at one another with nods of understanding. Then Keeley turned to me and said, concisely, "Gray, the dementia praecox patient is not Alma, but her sister, her twin sister, Alda. This twin did not die as a child, but lived, afflicted with this terrible disease. The mother of the little girl was so overcome with grief and shame that she pretended the child had died, and had the little grave made to give credence to the story." "Alda?" I said, dully, not quite taking it in. "That isn't a name." "It is the name of Alma's twin, anyway," March said, grasping me by the shoulder none too gently. "Wake up, man. You have something to live for now. Listen to me. Alma's twin sister is in the house at Whistling Reeds, and has been there all the time. While their mother was alive, she kept the girls at Pleasure Dome, Alma openly and Alda secretly. No one knew of the sisters' existence except the three Merivales and Griscom and Mrs. Fenn. They were bound to secrecy by Sampson Tracy, and he knew how to command obedience. Of course Tracy and Alma knew all. Then, when Alma's mother died, she left Alda as a sacred trust, and Alma has devoted her life to the afflicted twin. You see, Alda is normal and sane the greater part of the time, but she cannot be allowed to know people, for there is no telling when the spasms will come on. And when they do, there is no treatment necessary save to control and soothe her. The Merivales, with Alma, look after that, and much of the time the two girls are together. Now you see the truth of March's deductions that there was another inmate of the Whistling Reeds house," Keeley said. "Where they kept her, I don't know, but—" "Let's go right over there," March suggested. "It's only fair to end Miss Alma's misery and suspense as soon as possible." Still dazed and wondering, I watched the others recall Dr. Greenway and give him back the paper he had produced, and then we went away, back to Keeley's place, and into a boat and over to Whistling Reeds with all possible speed. The glum boatmaster greeted us surlily, as usual, but March paid no attention and made straight for the house. His ring was answered by Mary herself, and she looked very perturbed and anxious. "I'm glad you've come, gentlemen," she said. "We are in great trouble." It was then that I took the helm. As Alma's fiancé, for I so considered myself, it was my right and my duty to take matters in charge. "Mrs. Merivale," I said, simply, "we know all about Miss Alda." She staggered back a step, and then a look of relief passed over her strong, gaunt face. "Yes, sir," she said, apparently accustomed to accept the word of her superiors. "Then you can advise us, sir. Miss Alda is took very bad." "Do you want a doctor?" asked March hurriedly. "No, sir, a doctor can do nothing, nothing at all." "What can we do?" Keeley asked eagerly. "I don't know yet. Perhaps if you'd just wait down here till I see how she is now—" "Mary!" called a man's voice from upstairs, and she hurried away. I recognized the tones of John Merivale, and I did not offer to go upstairs with the nurse, knowing she would call us if necessary. I longed to be with Alma, to comfort and care for her, but I could not intrude uninvited. But after we had waited perhaps a half hour, Alma came downstairs and out on the porch where we sat. She was composed, but with a new sadness in her eyes and a new droop to her lovely lips. "I will tell you all," she said, quietly, as she sat down, opposite to the three of us. "Since you know of my sister's existence, there's no more occasion for secrecy." "Take it easy, Miss Remsen," said March, with well-meant kindness, and Keeley rose, and then went and sat beside her. I had an instant's flash of jealousy, then realized it was better so. This ordeal had to be gone through with, and were I near her, I should have been unable to resist the impulse to clasp her in my arms, in spite of the other's presence. Kee seemed to give her courage by his sympathy, and she began her story. "I am so alone," she prefaced it, "that I must tell it all in my own way. It is a strange story, but here are the facts. When my sister and I had scarlet fever, she did not die, but she at that time began to show symptoms of dementia praecox. My mother learned this, and knew the inevitable progress and end of the malady, so she declared that her little girl was dead to her and dead to the world, and should remain so, apparently. She therefore, with the knowledge and permission of Uncle Sampson, pretended that the child had died, and ever after kept her hidden from all but the few servants who knew about it. Uncle Sampson was very kind. I learned later that he thought my mother demented also, and that's why he humored her so. But she was not. Dr. Rogers will tell you that. The years went by, and while my mother made a pretense of sorrowing for her dead child, and often visited the little grave, she had great solace in taking care of my twin, Alda, and doing everything to make her life happy and pleasant. At Pleasure Dome, the grounds and house are so enormous, it was not difficult to keep up the pretense, and all went well until my mother died. As she left Alda to me, with an injunction to guard her as my life, I have tried to do all I could to obey her wishes. And I managed beautifully, until Uncle Sampson wanted to marry and bring a wife home. There was only one thing to do, so we did it. I moved over to this secluded spot, and lived here, keeping Alda's existence still a secret. The trouble came when Uncle Sampson determined to tell Mrs. Dallas about Alda. Uncle thought it dishonorable not to tell her, and I feared if she knew it, the secret would be a secret no longer. Uncle and I quarreled about this the last time I ever saw him. Emotion almost overcame Alma at this point, but she bravely controlled herself and went on. I told Mary about the quarrel, and Alda chanced to overhear me. You must realize that when she is not in the attacks of dementia, she is as sane as you or I. But she had got it into her head that Uncle Sampson had offended or injured me, and she resolved, I've learned from her since, that she would avenge that insult. Never before had she been inclined to homicidal mania, never did we think of her as becoming menacing or dangerous. Dr. Rogers would not have left her except that he thought she would go right along as she has been for years. A fit of fierce anger now and then, or a mad tempest of rage and foolish actions, always followed by a period of exhaustion and many days of languor. But this time the disease took a new turn, and Alda went over to Pleasure Dome, taking my key to let herself in. Like all unbalanced brains, hers has a crafty slyness, and she is very cunning when she wishes to be. She, I know now, for she has told me, read a story about a man who was killed by a nail driven in his head. Her poor distorted mind chose to imitate that act, and she took with her a nail and a mallet. She did kill Uncle Sampson, as he slept. She put all those strange things round about him. She threw his watch in the water pitcher. She is always throwing things away. And then she took all the waistcoats, which she coveted for her fancy work, the totem pole which she admired, and finding his door locked, she had locked it herself, she stepped up on the window sill and dived into the lake. She is a perfect mermaid in the water. She can dive anywhere, and swim for any length of time and under any conditions." "She had thrown out the waistcoats first?" asked March. "Had she? I dare say. She was a little lame just then, having twisted her ankle a bit, but she swam to her canoe, got in it, and paddled home in safety." "You didn't miss her while she was absent?" Keeley inquired, interestedly. "No, indeed. She hadn't been out at night lately, though at one time she did have the habit. She usually occupies the guest room, but when I have friends staying here, we keep her in a room in the third story. It is a pleasant room, but soundproof and securely barred. She was there during the funeral." "Then you knew nothing of the tragedy until next day?" "Nothing. And even then, when Mrs. Fenn called up and told me, I didn't think of Alda. I supposed it was heart failure or apoplexy. But when I learned of the nail, I suspected the truth, and later Alda told me all. She has no regret. I mean, her sense of right and wrong is so clouded now that she cannot think clearly. Her mentality has dwindled rapidly of late, and even now, she is sleeping after a sedative, I think she will not recover her mind to the extent of sanity she has shown of late. I'm not sure I am telling you this so you can understand it, but I am so stunned, so dazed, to think the time has come to tell it, that I want only to tell it truthfully and all at once. I don't want to have to go over it again." Merivale appeared in the doorway. "Miss Alma," she said, gravely and in solemn tone, "Miss Alda is going." Alma rose, not hastily, but with a swift dignity, and turning to me, said, "Come with me, Gray." It was like a chrism. I felt sanctified to be chosen to stand at her side in this supreme moment. The others followed us, but I did not know it then. Alma and I went up the stairs together, and she turned toward the guest room. There on the bed lay the counterpart of my own darling. I knew now that it was Alda whom I had seen that night in the canoe. It was Alda whom Posy May and her friends had seen in tantrums with the nurse. It was Alda who, poor demented, irresponsible child, had killed Sampson Tracy in blind imitation of the story she had read about the nail. She was beautiful, even as Alma was beautiful, but the light in her eyes was not the light of reason, rather the weird light of visions seemed by a deficient mentality. But even as we looked, the restless eyes closed, the restless body subsided into stillness, and a coma set in, from which Alda Remsen never awakened. We sent for a doctor, but there was nothing to be done, and though she lingered for 2 days, the spirit was at last set free, Alda was released, and Alma's long and ghastly term of servitude was over. It has ever since been my pleasure and duty to bring only sunshine into that life that knew no real sunshine for many long years. Alma felt she never wanted to see Pleasure Dome again, so the place was sold and we traveled in many lands, returning at last to found a home far removed from any memories of painful association. The Moores are still our dearest friends, and the Merivales our staunch henchmen and caretakers, while Alma and I, sufficient to one another, take for our motto, "All for love, and the world well lost." The End. End of The Deep Lake Mystery by Carolyn Wells. This recording has been by Roger Melin.